Hello, everybody. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Chris Templeton to our meeting tonight. Chris grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan. He earned his Baccalaureate of Science degree in biology from Denison University in Ohio, then a Master of Science degree from the University of Montana, and then his PhD in biology at the University of Washington. Chris works as an assistant professor in the Department of Biology at Western Washington University. For the past 20 years, Chris has been studying the ecology and evolution of bird behavior. In particular, he's been studying the meaning of bird songs of birds such as song sparrows, nuthatches, the wrens of South America, and chickadees, and also the impact of noise pollution on their songs. Chris lives in Bellingham with his wife, his two daughters, and a golden doodle. And in his free time, he enjoys sailing, paddling, hiking and camping, and making music. Welcome, Chris.
Well, thank you so much. It is an absolute delight to be here, and I'm really excited to get to speak with you today and share a little bit about some of the research that we've been doing. And this research is started back when I was a graduate student back at the University of Montana, and has sort of continued on. And so I'm going to tell you about a few different projects that sort of span that time, with the idea of really hoping that, next time you go out and you see these super common little birds, chickadees, maybe you have even more of an appreciation for some of the things that they're saying to each other. Now, the first thing that I want to tell you before we even start talking about chickadees, and I've started all of my sort of public talks this way for a while now, because I think this is probably the biggest, most important take home point that I can have. And that is that listening to birds makes you happy. Right. So you all are in the right place. So that's the really good news. A whole bunch of studies have been coming out over the past handful of years showing that bird watching decreases depression, stress, anxiety, showing that increasing the bird diversity around you by just 10% provides the same boost in happiness as a 10% pay raise would. And just hearing birds sing for a few minutes can dramatically increase your happiness. Okay. So hooray, we are all in the right place. You have taken on a wonderful hobby as a bird watcher that is going to increase your happiness and sort of benefit your stress and make you a better person. Right. So here you go. Here is your first boost in happiness. I am going to show you a bird, and we're going to listen to this guy sing. So you probably know maybe this is a song sparrow. And these are wonderful little birds that I studied for my PhD. And they're called song sparrows because they sing this absolutely beautiful song. They've got repertoires of maybe 10-ish songs. This bird sang the same one a couple times, but they also switch around every once in a while. And they do lots of neat things. And I was studying how they learn their songs for my PhD research. And of course, the problem with studying birds in the field is that they often fly away, which we ran into a bunch of times too. So what I was actually doing was radio tracking birds to try and figure out where they were moving during while they were learning how to sing. That's a totally different topic that maybe we can talk about another time. But today, what I want you to do is try and remember that song and think about what a song sparrow song sounds like. And we're going to see lots of pictures of sounds that birds make today. And so I want to start by just kind of showing you how scientists represent these. And so we call these sonograms. And here is sort of an example of a song sparrow song that would have musical notation, right? So if you play an instrument or if you read sheet music, then you would know that if you go higher up on the staff, well, these are going to be high pitch and these are going to be low pitch notes, right? Some of them are much longer than others, right? So this half note is much longer than these quarter notes, right? And so if I play this Song Sparrow song and you have an idea of musical notation, maybe you can follow along. Okay. And so this is one way that some people originally tried to represent um, the sounds that animals make. Okay. And I want you to keep this in mind because if you know that this part of the staff is pitch and this part is time, well, then you can also read a graph of the actual sort of amplitude and frequency changes over time. And this is what we call the sonogram, right? So we can get rid of the staff and we can just have this picture. And I'll play it again for you and you can see if you can follow along, right? Now, song sparrows are actually pretty slow as far as the bird world goes, but it's still pretty hard to follow along. So I'm going to slow this down to a quarter speed, so 1/4 of the speed. And this is what it sounds like. And maybe you can follow along now at quarter speed. Yeah. Okay, so some of these notes are really thin. So this sounds just like a kind of whistle, a pure tone. Some of them are really buzzy. Some of them alternate. Dit, 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 dit. And if I play that one more time, I'll just try and sort of follow along with the cursor, and you can sort of see how this works. Yeah. Now we're going to see lots of sonograms as we go today. So I wanted to just kind of introduce this idea to you. And this is how we study songs because as you saw earlier, like they go by really fast. And the reality is that bird brains are much better at processing acoustic information than ours are. Even though they have little teeny tiny brains, they're actually much better at this than we are. And probably some of you are familiar with sonograms and becoming more and more familiar with Merlin these days, which does this amazing thing where it shows you a real-time sonogram. Okay, so this is the song of a song sparrow. But the song is just one type of vocalization. So animals use vocalizations for all sorts of different things, attracting mates, defending territories, locating food, talking about danger, resolving conflicts, and so on, right? And as scientists, we describe the songs of birds as those vocalizations that are usually relatively complex. But what we really want to focus on are the function of these different vocalizations. So songs are the vocalizations that are used to attract mates and defend territories from rivals. And all of these other things, all of this sort of long laundry list of other functions of vocalizations, we would call calls. Okay, so calls are things that essentially are different than songs. And what I want to do for this talk today is focus on this bottom one here. So how do birds use their calls to avoid predators? Okay. And to tell you a bit about this, I want to focus on sort of the hero of this story, which is the black-capped chickadee, and one of my very favorite birds. I've worked on them for 20 some years now, and have just grown more and more fond of them the more I sort of spend time with them. Okay. Um, Chickadees produce an alarm call, and it sounds a bit like this. Okay. And so I want you to imagine that you are another chickadee or really any other kind of songbird, right? And you've just heard this chickadee call. But now I'm going to play a slightly different chickadee call for you. And I want you to see if, or hear if you can hear a difference, right? So here's the second one. Okay. they probably sounded pretty similar to you, right? But I will argue, and hopefully I will convince you today, that if you were a chickadee, being able to distinguish between these two different vocalizations could mean the difference between life and death, right? And that's because these alarm calls are absolutely critical signals for animals. Okay, so they're ecologically really important because they help animals not get eaten, right? Okay, so if you can avoid being preyed upon, then that's a really powerful selection force. Okay. There's been a lot of interest in alarm calls because they appear to be altruistic. Why should an animal that's detected a predator advertise that, thereby putting themselves at risk by making sounds, right? And advertising their location. Um, there's also a lot of interest because these are cognitively insightful. So there's been a ton of research trying to understand what alarm calls mean. And by better understanding what they mean, we can gain important insights into how an animal actually perceives its environment. Okay, so answering some of these questions really began with these two different systems. Okay. So over here is a ground squirrel, and over here is a vervet, right? And both of these systems have a variety of different alarm calls, but they communicate in different ways. And I'm going to start by telling you about how they might do that, right? So often when a prey species has different predators, and the predators vary in hunting strategies or risk levels. Well, this necessitates different kinds of escape responses in the prey, right? And if there are different escape responses, well, then other individuals in your social group that haven't actually seen or heard the predator might need to know which of those escape strategies to use. Okay. And what we see is that some species, like the two that I just showed you, have evolved different alarm calls for different types of predators. Okay. So the first one that I want to talk about today is what happens in vervet monkeys. Okay, so these are African monkeys that were really well studied by Dorothy Cheney and Robert Seyfarth, among others. And they have what we call a referential alarm call system. So essentially, what this means is that vervet monkeys have words for different predators. Okay, so if you were a vervet monkey and you heard this sound, well, then you would know that there was an eagle nearby. If instead you heard this sound, that would mean there was a snake. And then if you heard this sound, what do you think that means? Well, that is the leopard call. Okay. So vervet monkeys have these three different major classes of predators, and they hunt in very different ways. And each one necessitates a different escape response, right? So you could imagine that if there's a leopard hunting you, well, where's the safest place to be? It's on the very tippy top branches of the tree. Now, leopards can actually climb trees well, but they're too heavy for these really, light branches at the ends of the branches. Okay. But that's absolutely the worst place to be if there's an eagle nearby, right? Because that's the one place that they can get you. Okay. So the vervet monkeys need to know not just what's there, but they need to know how to escape from it. Okay, so we call this system functionally referential because what I hope you could hear is the call types are distinct. They all sound really different, right? Hope you could hear that. And the call types refer to specific types of predators. They don't say anything about the degree of risk. They don't say how close the leopard is or how big the leopard is or anything like that. They just say, hey, there's a leopard. Okay. Now, in contrast, ground squirrels of a bunch of different species have what we call risk-based alarm call systems. Now, they also have a couple different types of predators. So here's a bird, here's a golden eagle, and here's a mammal and a coyote, and they obviously have very different hunting strategies. Okay, but the ground squirrels, their calls sound instead like this. Okay, so that was a call that was given to an eagle. And here's a call that was given to a coyote. And what I hope you can hear here is that these are basically the same thing, right? So we would say these are graded. They're both kind of chirps, and the only thing that really differs is the frequency or the pitch at which the chirping happens, right? And what's even more interesting is that the high pitched ones are not always given to an eagle, and the low pitched ones are not always given to a coyote. Instead, the calls refer to the specific degree of threat that a given predator encounter requires. Okay. And this is important because ground squirrels, unlike vervet monkeys, really only have one escape response, right? So they have a burrow, they're a ground squirrel, right? All they need to know is how fast do I need to run into the burrow to escape from whatever predator is, right? And so if there's a coyote that's really close, they need to know it's really close. If there's a coyote that's really far away, then they don't need to go in as quickly. Okay? So we have this graded alarm call system or a risk-based alarm call system that's in real contrast to the vervet monkeys. Okay, so we have these two kind of different ways of thinking about the world or classifying the world, right? Of how an animal deals with its ecology. And this, I remember reading about these really important classic studies as a graduate student and thinking to myself, well, okay, well, what happens if an animal has both of these challenges? So, what signaling strategy should an animal use when it faces a variety of predators that vary in both the type and the degree of danger? And that was where I started studying black-capped chickadees. Um, these wonderful little birds, and maybe some of you have gotten them to come take food out of your hands. Um, they're they're really neat, right? So they're broadly distributed throughout much of North America. They're broadly distributed throughout much of Washington State as well. And they're really neat because right now they're in stable social flocks of maybe six or eight individuals. And these flocks are made up of mated pairs, right? And they have multi-year pair bonds where, the pairs from the flock are going to break up and then they will mate and then they maybe come back together. Okay. And the reason chickadees are really useful for studies like this is because they're basically like candy. So everybody wants to eat a chickadee. They are susceptible to many different predators, and these predators hunt differently and they vary in risk. Okay, so this is why I really started getting interested in chickadee vocalizations. And so before I tell you a little bit about alarm calls specifically, I want to tell you a little bit about the language of chickadees or how they communicate. Okay, so chickadees have 17 different call types at least. And what's interesting about these calls is that each one is highly variable and context specific. Now, this means that different subtle variations of some calls might mean different things. It also means the same call used in different social contexts or ecological contexts might mean different things as well. Okay. And chickadees have been well studied over the last, oh gosh, getting on 50 years, right? And they seem to have one of the most complex communication systems that we know of. Okay, so here is one of their vocalizations that maybe you're familiar with. Okay, so again, we've got a sonogram over here. So remember, this is high pitch and this is low pitch and this is time. Okay, and chickadees have a vocalization called the song, right? And maybe you know this as "Hey, sweetie" or "Phoebe." Or sometimes it's called cheeseburger, but it sounds like this. Okay, this sort of beautiful whistled notes. This functions because it's a song. It functions in territory defense and mate attraction. It needs to be learned, even though it's a really simple vocalization, it needs to be learned from others. And then there's some neat things about this where they can shift the pitch up and down, and changes in the pitch are not only variable and flexible, but they are meaningful in terms of the song contests that male birds are having with each other. Okay, so there's a song. Here's another vocalization that you might hear a lot, especially around bird feeders. Okay, and this is called the gargle or T-slink. Okay, and it sounds like this. Okay, so played that twice. And this is an aggressive signal of dominance, right? So if you heard a bird, if you were a chickadee sitting at a feeder and you heard another bird do this, it would mean that if you don't get out of the way, if you don't give up this resource, well, that other bird's going to come over and kick your butt, right? So this is often precedes displacement or even fights. This seems to be a really complex vocalization, and each bird uses up to 23 different syllables that can sort of be recombined into its gargle. Okay. Now, what I want to talk about today is chickadee alarm signals. And so here's how we started studying alarm calls in chickadees. So I was at the University of Montana in Missoula, and I was working with Eric Green, who was a professor there until just a couple of years ago when he retired. And we had this wonderful outdoor aviary there. And so we went to a lot of work to sort of create this really natural environment for flocks of chickadees to spend, a month or so of their winter, right? And you see, we've got a bunch of feeders, we've got some really nice snags, and we'd go through and we'd hide mealworms in all of the little crevices every day. We have some roosty boxes. And just to give you an idea of the scale, here is a chickadee sitting on top of this snag back here, okay? Now, I was interested in how they communicate about predators. And so the way that we studied this was we were really fortunate to work with Kate Davis from Raptors of the Rockies, which is a wonderful raptor rehabilitation and education program in Montana. And so working with Kate allowed us to use live raptors that we would put in the aviary with the chickadees. And so we could then use these sort of large microphones to record the responses of individual chickadees. Now, in case you're worried about the chickadee, you should know that all of these raptors are actually tethered down, so they can't fly and go actually eat a chickadee. But the chickadees didn't know this, okay? And so when chickadees encounter predators, they would produce a lot of vocalizations. Alarm calls that we call it, right? And chickadees are interesting in that they actually have two different types of alarm calls, okay? So the top one up here, we call the seat alarm call, and that sounds like this. Okay, so it's really high pitched. It's difficult to localize. In fact, it's almost impossible for raptors to hear this because it's just above their hearing threshold. And so this is used when a chickadee detects a flying raptor. Okay, and when a bird produces this signal, it causes other individuals that hear it to absolutely just freeze, right? Maybe they'll dive for cover first, but they won't move at all and they'll try and remain undetectable. Okay. Now, in contrast, chickadees have another call that we call the chickadee. Okay, and so here's a picture of it down here. It sounds like this. Okay, so chickadee dee dee. It's what the species was named for. It's probably something that you're well familiar with. This is very cleverly made up of these four different syllables, A, B, C, and D. Okay, very original names, but pretty functional, and especially the D D D part is what we think of as the D in the chickadee's name. Now, this vocalization is used not when raptors are flying overhead, but when a chickadee detects a perched raptor, like I showed you in the aviary on the last picture, right? It's also used when they detect mammals, so terrestrial things or perched things that aren't actively hunting. Okay, and this has a very counterintuitive response by receivers, which is that they actually will move towards the signaler looking for the predator. And then all of the chickadees will gang up together and mob the predator. So they will dive bomb it, they'll yell in its face, making lots of these chickadee calls. Sometimes they'll even try and strike it on the back of the head. And the idea is that this mobbing call is so annoying, or mobbing call and behavior is so annoying that it causes the raptor to just get up and move out of the way. Much like, sitting in you go on these field trips, right? And if there was one campground that was just full of mosquitoes, maybe you'd move to a different campground that didn't have mosquitoes, right? So it's the same sort of idea. Okay. But we have two very different ways of dealing with predators and two very different ways of communicating about predators. Okay. Now, working with Kate Davis, we were able to show chickadees a wide variety of different predators, right? So can you identify all of these different species? What do you notice that's different about them? They vary in a whole bunch of different ways, right? So some are nocturnal, some are diurnal, some are bird specialists, some eat small mammals. We have mammals as well as birds here, so a cat and a ferret. But one thing that I think I'm going to argue is maybe the most important variable here is body size, right? And maybe that was something that you thought of too when you saw all of those predators. And I will argue that because of physics, body size is probably the most important variable here in determining which species are most dangerous to chickadees. Now, when you look at these two predators, right? So we have a great gray owl sitting on my gloved hand. It has those weapons, those sharp talons, right? I have to wear a glove just to hold it. Or here's a pygmy owl that's so cute and it's perched on my finger, right? When you look at these, you probably think, oh, the great gray owl is much more dangerous. But if you were a chickadee or another little bird about this size, then exactly the opposite would be true. And that's because predator maneuverability determines which predators can actually catch a chickadee. And if you want to be able to eat a chickadee, then you first have to be able to catch it, right? It's only these small, highly maneuverable predators that can do that. Okay, so we can use this information to sort of create this theoretical degree of risk for different predators, where we have small predators posing high risk and large predators that should pose low risk. But of course, we wanted to know what the chickadees thought about this. So we went through and we recorded the chickadee calls, okay? And we're going to focus on these D notes in the chickadee call, right? And remember, this sounds like this. Okay. And if we count the DDDs at the end of this call, that's what's over here on this y-axis of the graph. We're going to compare that with the size of the predator. So we've got really large predators over here and really small predators over here. And what I hope you can see is that there's a really nice relationship here between predator body size and the number of D notes in a call. Okay, so if you're interested in these sorts of things, we also have a couple different kinds of control. So the dashed line is no predator at all. Here's a bobwhite quail, which is small but doesn't actually eat chickadees. But the take-home point here really is that D is for danger, right? So the more Ds, the more dangerous. So you might have for a pygmy owl a call that looks like this, a whole bunch of Ds. For a great gray owl, you might just have a couple Ds. Okay. Now, if you look really closely at the line and you are a pretty good birder, well, you'll discover that chickadees are maybe better birders than this simple relationship predicts too, right? So things that are bird specialists. So maybe a Cooper's hawk is a bird specialist. Peregrine falcon is a bird specialist. Well, these are up above the line, right? And things like a kestrel that doesn't really eat that many birds. They eat mice and grasshoppers and that sort of thing more commonly. Well, those are down below the line. So chickadees are really good birders. But the take-home point here is really that this idea of D is for danger. Okay, and we were really excited about this when we first sort of revealed it, because this combines aspects of both functional reference and risk-based signaling systems, right? So remember, the functional reference was the vervet monkeys, and risk-based signaling was the ground squirrels. And for chickadees, it's the call type that refers to the specific type of encounter. Is the predator flying or is it perched? Well, that determines which call a particular individual is going to get. And then the more subtle variations within each of these calls signal the actual danger level, right? So what we have is a new kind of signaling system that really combines both of these, the best of both worlds. Okay. Now, one of the things that we did is then we took these sounds and we played them back to other chickadees to show that communication actually takes place. But reading the literature, we discovered that not only other black-capped chickadees, but other species of chickadees are also known to respond to these chickadee mobbing calls, right? And it's not just chickadees, but nuthatches and woodpeckers and kinglets and a whole bunch of different species. In fact, more than 50 different species are known to respond to chickadee calls. And maybe you've taken advantage of this yourself to recruit some other species that maybe you're having a hard time seeing. If you go pish, psh, 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 you are mimicking a chickadee, right? And all of these other species are responding. Okay. We were interested then in saying, okay, well, we know all these other species respond. Do any of them actually know the difference between these subtle variations in the chickadee calls? Okay. And so we did some experiments with red-breasted nuthatches. We said, do nuthatches understand chickadees? Right. Um, and so I went back to Montana after I'd moved and started my PhD at the University of Washington in Seattle. And I went back to Montana one winter to do these experiments. And it was so cold that I could go out and I could do like a couple trials and then I'd have to run back to my car and blast the heat. You can see it's really, this wonderful, beautiful, snowy habitat. As well. And what I was doing here was I would go out and I'd find a pair of nuthatches, and then I would hide a speaker behind or below a tree. And then from that speaker, I could play back different vocalizations from chickadees, right? So I could have chickadee calls that should mean there's a large owl, not very threatening. Chickadee calls that should mean there's a small owl, like a pygmy owl, very threatening. And then we also played back just other calls from another species that shouldn't be meaningful at all to the chickadees. Okay? And remember, these are chickadee calls that should mean these things, not the calls of the predators. Okay. Because these are mobbing calls, right? I hope that it would make sense to you that what we expect to find is that the nuthatches should approach the speaker. Again, they're looking for the predator and preparing to mob it when they find it. Okay, so if we measure how many of them get to the tree or how close to the tree they get, one of the things that we discovered is that nuthatches discriminate among chickadee call variations. And they use the information in these chickadee calls to make really sophisticated decisions about which predators to investigate. They got a lot closer to the speaker when we were playing chickadee calls that should mean there was a high threat predator, right? And so this was a really neat study because it demonstrated that other species are eavesdropping on all of this important information that's found within these chickadee calls. Okay. Now, if you have seen nuthatches before, well, maybe you've also heard them. They make a sound that sounds like this. So this sort of yank, 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 yank sound. And I largely ignored this when I was originally doing these studies. But my first graduate student, Nora Carlson, showed up when I was at the University of St. Andrews, and she said, well, what about the nuthatch calls? They're making these calls. What kind of information is in these calls, and how much are different species paying attention? Are the chickadees listening to the nuthatches as well as the nuthatches listening to the chickadees? Okay, and so again, in collaboration with Eric Green, we did a study to examine whether nuthatches vary their own calls to reflect predator threat. Okay. And so then the first thing that we did was we went out with another speaker and we played back the calls of different owl species, right? And here's what they look like. So here are the calls of a pygmy owl. Maybe you're familiar with this kind of toot, or the calls of a great horned owl. And then here are some control calls from a house sparrow. Okay, so when given direct information, I can hear that there is that specific predator there. How do nuthatches react? And here is essentially how they do it. Okay, so when there is a high threat pygmy owl there, they produce calls that look something like this, right? And they sound like this. Okay, so this kind of fast and furious yank, 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 yank kind of thing. But when they are confronted with a large owl that doesn't pose as much of a threat or a control, then they produce sounds that sound like this. Okay, so this tells us that nuthatches adjust their own vocalizations, much like chickadees do, to encode information about predator threat. Okay, so nuthatches are also producing information. So then this takes us back to another experiment that we did where we asked, okay, well, we know that nuthatches are reacting to chickadee, to the information in chickadee calls, right? They're behaving differently if they hear a chickadee talk about a pygmy owl than if they hear a chickadee talk about a great horned owl. But do they also then propagate this information onto other birds? And the answer seems to be no, which I think is really interesting, right? So we know nuthatches adjust their own vocalizations to encode information about predator threat, but they do this only when they have direct personal information about the predators, when they hear those predators and they know exactly what there is. And they do this differently if they only have social information, meaning they heard a chickadee talk about what the chickadee thought was there. Okay, and so I think we might have different strategies for dealing with information based upon the perceived reliability of that information, right? And here's the analogy, right? So if you heard somebody say, "Help! There's a fire," right? Um, what comes into your mind when you hear that? Well, both of these are fires, right? But they obviously have tremendously different scales, right? And so if a nuthatch hears a chickadee say, "Oh, there's a predator there," and if the chickadee is really upset about it, well, then maybe the chickadee thinks it's a pygmy owl, but the nuthatch doesn't really know that, right? And without fully understanding exactly what's there, the nuthatches seem to be hedging their bets, behaving as though, oh yeah, the chickadee says there's a really dangerous thing, and then going and investigating it. Once it actually discovers which kind of fire is there, then it will produce its own calls to warn its mate. Okay, so there's lots of really sophisticated information that's being shared among these chickadees and other songbirds. Um, Now, for the last thing I want to tell you about today, I want to tell you about another sort of fire, or at least another sort of challenge that animals have. And it's a growing and growing challenge, which is anthropogenic noise, right? And so it's kind of the last project I want to tell you about asks, how does noise pollution impact all of this really sophisticated information that's being shared by chickadees and other birds? Okay, so anthropogenic noise is everywhere. There's all sorts of different sources, including planes and boats, leaf blowers, and of course, I-5 is familiar to many of us that are in sort of the Seattle corridor. Okay, when we think about road noise, well, road noise is also everywhere and it's increasing, right? In fact, there's 4 million miles of roads in the US, and they take up about 1% of the total land area, just the surface of the roads, right? So this shows you kind of the nearest distance to a road, with sort of these green areas being the only locations without significant traffic noise. Now, we're in Washington State are really lucky to actually be pretty close to some of these green areas, but that's not true for most of the country. And in fact, there's several areas that are still really noisy, even where we are. Okay, so we can ask the question, and we did ask the question with Sue-Ann Zollinger and Henrik Brum, a couple of my colleagues in Europe. How does anthropogenic road noise impact alarm calls? Okay, and so now I'm going to introduce you to a sort of European chickadee called the great tit. Okay, so they're basically chickadees. They're a little flashier in terms of their sort of yellow bellies and sort of green backs. But they do a lot of similar things to our North American chickadees, including producing a sound that sounds a lot like a chickadee alarm call, like this. Okay. And we did a series of experiments where we looked at both production of alarm calls in noise and responses of birds hearing alarm calls under noisy conditions. And when we looked at call production, okay, so we varied the level of noise within a lab environment so we could really carefully control it. And we measured the alarm calls in the same individual birds in both a quiet environment of about 22 decibels and a noisier environment of about 70 decibels. Okay. And if you measure the amplitude of the bird sounds, you can see that the same individuals are connected in different colors, right? So each of them increases the amplitude or the loudness of their vocalizations when it's noisy out. Okay. So call amplitude increases with frequency, with noise, but frequency variables don't, right? And this maybe shouldn't be surprising. Lots of animals do this. In fact, it's got a fancy name. It's called the lumbar effect. And you know what? We do this too. And maybe you're familiar with this. If you go out to a loud cocktail party, or a loud truck drives by on the highway when you're speaking to somebody, you will subconsciously just start speaking louder. Okay. So it's not surprising, but it still gives us something to ask. Well, maybe wild birds can actually use this increase in amplitude to overcome some of the negative effects of traffic noise. Okay, so we went and did an experiment in the field, and we had birds that were at a feeder. Okay, so here's a bird at a feeder, and we went and played back different combinations of alarm calls, mobbing alarm calls, or traffic noise, right? And so we had some treatments that were just mobbing calls. So we know they should react to those by approaching the speaker, stopping feeding. We had some treatments that were just traffic noise. So these are kind of negative controls that they shouldn't really care about. And then we had the combination. So we had both mobbing calls plus realistic levels of traffic noise for a bird that's about 20 meters away from a moderately busy road. And then we had a reduced amplitude version that should simulate a bird that's living about 40 meters away from a road. Okay. And what we see when we look at these different treatments for both feeding and how many alarm calls the birds are producing is that there's a significant effect of traffic noise on responses, right? So if you just play traffic noise, they don't react at all. They just keep feeding. They don't really produce any alarm calls, right? If you just play alarm calls by themselves, well, almost all the birds stop feeding. And what do? Well, they start producing a lot of alarm calls themselves. But what's really interesting are these intermediate treatments, right? And when you play alarm calls plus noise, what you see is this is statistically no different than just hearing noise at all, right? So they essentially can't hear it. They don't stop feeding. They don't produce their own alarm calls, right? And this is certainly true for birds living 20 meters away from the road, but we also have reduced responses of birds that are simulated living 40 or more meters away. Okay, so traffic noise masks alarm calls and they affect these critical signals for at least 40 meters away from the road. Okay. So this is sort of the doom and gloom part of the talk, right? Because what I'm telling you is that these signals are absolutely critical for these animals' survival, and yet they're having a hard time being heard over traffic noise. Okay. We know that roads indirectly influence predation rate, time budgets, foraging, habitat use, and population and community structures. And they also seem to impact how animals communicate. Okay. So it's been a great joy talking with you today. Just to kind of wrap up, I want to sort of summarize the key points here. And those really are that chickadees communicate sophisticated information about predator threat, right? And I hope you take away that D is for danger. So if you go hear lots of D's, D, 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 well, maybe there's a small owl nearby or a cat or something like that that you can use that to go find. I also told you that other species eavesdrop on alarm calls, and they make pretty nuanced decisions about mobbing based upon this information. So birds seem to be pretty skeptical of fake news. Traffic noise impacts both alarm signal production and perceptions. Noise is really annoying. And last, paying attention to bird vocalizations can provide a really important window to understanding their cognition in ecology. And perhaps most important, it makes you happy. Thank you all very much.
Raucous applause. Raucous applause. Chris, that was fantastic. Well, everyone gets their synapses to stop whizzing around. Uh, may I mention, I think many of you know that there are some nice references, URLs, links that have been placed in the chat. And while you're still in the meeting, if you click on them, they will open behind your browser and you can look at them later. They're really quite wonderful. Um, if anyone has questions, this is a wonderful opportunity to have a dialogue as close as we can when it's on Zoom. Jeff Kozma in Yakima. May I read off? Jeff has written, why don't red-breasted nuthatches trust chickadee calls to identify the predator correctly? Why do nuthatches need to visually identify the predator for nuthatches to give the appropriate call? It seems chickadees should use the appropriate call for the appropriate predator. Lots of D's for the northern pygmy owl, for example, or they would be sending false information to their own flock mates. Those
Yeah, so I think
sneaky,
that
sneaky chickadees.
sneaky chickadees. And I don't think the chickadees are trying to be sneaky necessarily. There are certainly other species of birds that will give false alarm calls. Um, And I also don't think nuthatches necessarily need to visually identify the predators, right? So we did one experiment where we just played the predator sounds, and that seemed to also give nuthatches this primary firsthand experience or information about the predators. But I think the analogy here is that although the chickadees are um, probably advertising real and reliable information about their experience with the predators, well, their experience is going to be colored by their own experience in life, right? So if a chickadee is maybe stressed out about something else, then maybe it would have a heightened reaction to the same species of predator than it would in other situations where it wasn't stressed out. Maybe it would have a reduced reaction to that predator if it was in a flock already versus if it was by itself, right? And so all of these things, I think, are somewhat open for interpretation, right? Just like if I was, and the example is if I was shouting fire, you'd know there was some kind of fire, but you maybe wouldn't know exactly how dangerous that fire was unless you could really get into my psyche. And I think there's probably some nuanced decisions that chickadees are making because they are different individuals, just like we are all different individuals and we perceive our environment slightly differently. So that's what we think is going on. We're still trying to figure it out, though.
Fantastic. I bet several people will be nodding their heads along with me on this one, and one has written in, when I go out on my deck where I have sunflower seeds, and sometimes I stick them inside of branches so I make them stick around for more than 2 seconds.
Oh, that's clever.
They'll know that I'm coming out there and they'll start DDDing. Now, I don't ever want to think that they think I'm a threat. Do you have Interpretation about that. Maybe it's slightly different D and I can't hear the difference.
Yeah, and so I think that's exactly what's going on. They don't think of you as a threat unless maybe you've gone out and caught them a whole bunch of times. Even then,
Oh
I'm
no.
not sure. Probably you haven't done that. I think the reality is that this chickadee call that we hear all over the place is one example of one of their vocalizations that has a whole bunch of different functions. Most of those functions seem to be related to recruitment, right? So the one I talked about is this mobbing function, where D is for danger. You hear a whole bunch of Ds, then that indicates that there's there's a really dangerous predator, and that brings the birds all together. But other situations might also be beneficial if the birds sort of came together towards the signaler. And one of them is actually when there's food, right? And so some other people have demonstrated that the chickadee calls also, like certain different notes in the chickadee calls, maybe the C notes, which is kind of that these ones over here, might actually indicate that there is food around. And so my guess is if we looked really closely at the acoustic structure of the chickadees calls that you're getting when you take those sunflower seeds out into the background or backyard, you would see lots of C notes instead of lots of D notes in those calls.
Wonderful. I'll have to do a little experiment.
Yeah, that'd be
Let me
great.
give a short one. Have any chickadee calls changed over the years here in the Pacific Northwest in response to the increased abundance of barred owls? But they're big.
They are big, yeah. And I don't think anybody really knows anything about long-term longitudinal studies of how chickadee vocalizations, at least the anti-predator vocalizations, have changed over time. And you're right, barred owls are big, and they pose a pretty low threat to chickadees. So they would receive relatively few D notes if a chickadee encountered one.
We have the pleasure of having a licensed wildlife rehabilitator here who works with songbirds often. Your presentation has been absolutely fascinating and has actually gotten me thinking in some fun inverse applications. Since you've shown that chickadees advertise information about predators that other species recognize and respond to, have you found particular chickadee calls that signal an all clear or safety? I'm curious if this might be something that could be leveraged as ambient noise in a rehab clinic to reduce stress in other species.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So I haven't done these studies myself, but it was reported sort of a long time ago. I think this was either Penny Ficken or Jack Haleman's work that showed that when a raptor flies over and they produce a lot of these high frequency sort of alarm calls that causes everybody to freeze, that a chickadee would actually produce one of their chickadee calls as an all clear call. So I think that this is something that very well might exist. And yeah, maybe you could use that to sort of leverage a reduced stress level in your rehab birds. That would be pretty cool.
Really, really. Um, Chris, have you studied the vocalizations of chickadees, the vocalizations that chickadees make if there's more than one type of threat at the same time? For instance, a Cooper's hawk and a cat in the area.
No, we haven't, but I think that would be a pretty neat thing to do for sure. And how do they deal with two different locations as well as two different threats? Yeah, it'd be pretty fun studies to do. Maybe someday.
Um, the other wonderful topic that you touched on at the end, I think a number of us may have read that white-crowned sparrows, I think it was, who had been followed for many years anyway, during the pandemic, during that first year when the road noise and everything went down, they started sounding off differently. Their calls and songs were quieter, and they perhaps behaved in a different way, more along the natural behavior of birds living in an urban environment. You have any comments on that one?
It's a fantastic study that was led by Liz Derryberry. And I mean, it's wonderful to see that that some of these birds can sort of change their behavior relatively quickly in response to noise. We've been doing some kind of, we don't have the longitudinal data, but we've been doing kind of short-term experiments with noise pollution and seeing similar things with some of the species here in Western Washington, where they can actually change the song structure, change the frequency or whatnot in real time when they're confronted with noise. So I think these are absolutely real effects. And yeah, they're sort of dramatic effects. We're not necessarily seeing the same thing with these alarm calls. And I think part of the reason that these chickadee calls in particular are really challenging to change is because they include a lot of really low frequency sounds, right? And in fact, a lot of the information in these chickadee calls is in these low frequency DDD notes, and that is going to overlap with traffic noise, right? Which also tends to be low frequency. Okay, so that makes it much more difficult for the chickadees to sort of adapt to changes in noise level, like you're describing with the white-crowned sparrows. So I'm not really sure what hope there is for chickadees, but we'll find out, I guess.
If anyone has a question they'd like to just unmute and speak rather than type in, please do. A raised hand does not allow me to do anything. Bizarre comment. Yeah. Chris, the wildlife rehab person asked, could you kindly type in the names of those individuals into the chat? He would like to follow up. Do you know what I'm talking about? The idea of there being you mentioned, I think you
yeah,
mentioned
I'm
two
not
names.
sure. It's been a long time since I've read those studies, and I'm not really sure who did it.
If
One
it's
thing I
okay,
will say is that Susan Smith wrote a book all about the black-capped chickadee. That's a wonderful read. It's pretty digestible. It's sort of a science book, but with actual data in it. But it's also very digestible. And I know she talks a lot about those studies in that book. So you could definitely find it there.
would you
And I
be
can't remember.
okay? Sorry, Chris. Would you be okay with my putting your email address in the chat if anyone wanted to be in touch? Is that all right?
Sure, yeah, that's fine. And if you are interested in getting in touch, there's a link to my website on this slide that you can see, and there's also a QR code that will take you to the website. If you want to learn more about what we're doing, or if you want to get in touch, yeah, please check that out.
The link to, well, you don't have to have the link. You can just look up Chris Templeton's lab. He has a fabulous site with PDFs of all the, well, maybe it's not all of your publications, but a great number of publications that many of which touch on this information. Really fascinating stuff and conveniently placed so that you don't have to figure out a URL. Any other questions, folks?
Elaine, there's another question there.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, I've lost my thing. Can you read it?
It says from Steve, you mentioned that people commonly use pishing to attract birds. Have you thought about which kinds of chickadee calls should or should not be used by common birders to attract birds?
Yeah, I mean, I think you mean as far as like playing back different sounds. Is that what you're thinking? Yeah, and I know it's really fun to do that, and it's really powerful to go play back, say, chickadee mobbing calls, because it gets everybody to pop up. Same thing with playing back songs, right? To get territorial birds to sort of pop up and show themselves. And the reason that these are so powerful is because these are really critical signals for these animals. And so you're not going to like this answer, but I really think that probably we shouldn't be using playback of any sort to do to be able to see birds, because these are really important signals. And if you play a song of a bird, that there's data that show that can affect that animal for a long time, right? Because it's going to be looking for that intruder. It's going to change his hormonal profiles and whatnot. So it's not the answer you want to hear, but I think probably none of them. Yeah.
I think we do want to hear that.
Could I add
okay,
something
great.
to that?
Absolutely. Go ahead, Gretchen.
I also heard, someone saying a similar thing, and that think about the calories that they're using, and they're not spending time feeding while they're responding to this call that isn't real. And that,
Or attending to the sharp-shinned hawk that's about to
yeah,
take. Yeah,
yeah,
those are all
yeah.
bird ethics. Anyone else? Oh my gosh, what a wonderful presentation that we'll be watching over and over thanks to your giving us permission to record it.
And
Sammy?
thank you, Chris, for your entertaining and informative discussion about one of our favorite birds, the chickadee. And just really grateful for your time and insight, and especially like the last bit about using phishing calls. That's very, very important message. And I just wanted to let everyone know our next presentation will be March 2nd, and we're having Madison Mayfield, and she's a very talented woman who works at the Burke Museum, and she's going to talk about the Burke Museum bird collection and her life experience as a taxidermist and an scientific artist. So thank you everybody for coming, and we'll close the meeting for tonight. Good night.
Thank you,
And I'll
Chris.
also say she's wonderful. She's made a couple fantastic taxidermy raptors that we've been using. I didn't get to show you any of our robots, but maybe another talk we can talk about the robots we've been using instead of real live birds. And Madison's created some of them. So you'll enjoy that one too.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.